how can we make workplaces better places to be for employees, for leaders? How can we make companies better for the world? Today's guest, Jess Stuart, describes herself as a former high-functioning burned out executive. She worked in HR and climbing the corporate ladder, being high achievement, looking for external validation for her work led her to physical, mental, emotional, spiritual burnout at the age of 31, after which she got her life back together by traveling around the world studying with Buddhists, with practicing Buddhist monks and nuns all over the world, and came back with a renewed sense of what needs to happen in Western business world in order to create sustainability. Now, I love this conversation because about 8 years ago, I helped co-found a digital wellness company, WellStart Health, and we came into organizations saying we're going to basically help you improve your economics by helping your people engage in lifestyle habits, diet, exercise, stress management, breathing, all the cool stuff, sleep hygiene, so that they are healthier and require fewer days of absenteeism and less medical care, which was going to help companies save money. We didn't make it. We were not able to articulate a message that really spoke to the needs of the business as they understood it at that time. And one of the things I love about the work of today's guest, Jess Stuart, is that she manages to do this. She can speak. If you go to her website, which I'll say it now, Jess Stuart, STUART.co.nz or NZ from New Zealand, and it's in the show notes as well. You'll see that she talks about making the world a better place in very clear, passionate language, and at the same time talks about the business needs and how the work she does to help specifically women leaders, but all leaders and all employees not burn out, be more sustainable, focus on the quality of their work in their lives rather than the quantity of their productivity. I think it's a message that is very, very valuable, and she does a great job of bridging this, altruistic vision with the language that is going to get business people to pay attention and pay for it, and once it's paid for, get people to actually engage and implement. So this is a conversation that was really valuable for me as someone who's in the same space and who's learning how to do this. I hope it'll be valuable for you too, whether you're a leader in an organization or whether you're just dealing with this modern epidemic of more and more work with less and less to show for it. So without further ado, Jess Stuart, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thanks, Howie. Nice to be here.
It's going to be a fun conversation. For people who are not watching on video, you have the most amazing shirt. I don't know if it's a shirt or a blouse. I'm not into fashion, but you got says love and motion and all these words, and it feels like you're already sort of expressing a lot of what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I love this shirt. And I often get a lot of comments on it, even when I'm just stood in queues. People will comment on it when I'm wearing it.
And it matches your smile. So I feel like there's a lot of positivity coming everybody's way today. I want to start by asking you to talk a little bit about the sentence that you start your biography in the networking group in which we met, which is you apply ancient wisdom to modern problems. And you say a couple words about that?
Yeah, sure. I guess it was through my own lived experience that I realized that a lot of our modern problems, and certainly the problems I'd experienced, particularly around burnout and this very kind of always-on culture that we live in, the solutions to these problems have been around for many, many years. We've just lost touch with them. And I went off in search of some of those solutions. And I guess my passion has always been, my background been in human resources and a very Western people psychology basis to my career, has always been, where does that meet with some of our ancient Eastern wisdom that has stood the test of time for a reason, that can still be applied in a way that makes sense to the modern world?
So maybe let's unpack a little bit of the backstory. So you're doing traditional, right, HR, so in a Western way, and I assume part of that is the language of that people are resources,
Yes.
right? So tell me about that world and what led to your break with it.
Yeah. And you're exactly right. We do treat humans as resources. And for me, the thing I didn't realize is that I was my most precious resource and I was wasting that resource. So I was flying around the country. I was at all different offices, in the car all the time, in meetings, never any time for me, never any time to rest, to recover. But I also didn't think I needed that. It was never something anybody had pitched as part of peak performance. And eventually I hit burnout. And that caused me to take a step away from my career and think about there's got to be another way to do this. There's got to be another way to perform at our peak and not have to self sacrifice in the process. And so that took me across the world to train with Buddhist monks and nuns in various different countries, and obviously witnessed probably what you would call the opposite end of the extreme. And of course, living on a hilltop as a monk, if you're up in the Himalayas and you've got no company car or credit card statement or relationship or job, it's probably quite easy to be a bit more zen. And so for me, the passion was, well, where do you take those two ends of the extreme and put them together in the middle and do it in a way that's useful for everybody?
Hmm. Was there a moment of clarity about the burnout? Sort of, like if we were making the movie, like would there be a scene?
Yes, definitely. There's always, I think with any of these experiences, there's always a dropping to the floor scene in the movies. Um, that was certainly my experience too. So it was a very physical hitting of the wall in the middle of a gym class, oddly enough, on my 31st birthday. Um, but it was the emotional crashing down of everything else around that that
Mhm.
made me realize what was happening. And I think in hindsight, the signs had been there for a while, but I was too busy to notice them. And so recovering from burnout gave me a lot of time and space to think about what I'd learned and how to do things differently and to get curious about another way of doing things. Because everywhere I looked in the corporate world and throughout my peers and the industry I was in, everybody seemed to be doing the same thing and therefore repeating the same mistakes. And I was surrounded by other colleagues who had also hit burnout and were struggling.
Hmm. But now for you, you could hit burnout and stop. I mean, when I look around, I don't see a lot of 31-year-olds stopping. I see them doing other things to keep going, whether it's, self-destructive behaviors, drugs, throwing themselves into climbing the corporate ladder. Like I can see, like there's still a functioning something inside the shell, but there's a lot of misery. What do you think made you decide, like, I'm not going to keep going, even though that's, maybe the programming that I received culturally or familially? I don't know.
Mm. Oh, and I'd definitely done that. For the years prior to that, I was a high functioning, burnt out executive. And I didn't choose to step away. It was a forced choice in that my health, it had taken its toll on my health to the point where I couldn't work anymore. And so I had to have some time off with this physical injury that I'd sustained. But the emotional injury that unfolded at that same time was the one that really forced me into having to make a plan B. And so I don't know, had I not have been forced by my health, I don't know if I would have had the awareness or given myself the permission to step away voluntarily, because I think that's the problem with a lot of us in this position. We feel like it's a sign of weakness. We can't stop.
Hmm.
We need this job to pay our bills. We also need to prove ourselves, and we're driven by the achievement. And so I don't think many of us choose to step away sensibly. We're often forced to step away
Hmm.
because we've gone too
Hmm.
far.
Now, in the movie, the protagonist who has this would go off, but trying to solve the problem at kind of a lower level of consciousness, right? Was that you? Like, I need to figure out how to get my mojo back so I can keep climbing, or like when you went to look for this other wisdom?
Yeah, I think initially it started that way. It initially had started as a bit of therapy. I need something to help me recover. I'll go straight to the source and find the most peaceful, calm people I've ever seen and find out how they do it. That I think is how it started. But it quickly changed into something different. It quickly changed into me understanding, oh, okay, there's another way. There's another way of doing things. It doesn't have to be this way. And from that point, which was very early on in the journey, it became a curiosity to learn more and share more about this with others so that we could redefine what that landscape looked like and what peak performance could be in a way that made it more sustainable for people.
Mm. I love the pun of like peak performance in the West and peak performance like the guy on a mountaintop in on a Buddhist monastery. They're obviously very different peaks. Um, I mean, how do you? And this is like I wrote. This is what I wrote to you in the email when we were talking about having this conversation. How do you reconcile like the idea of using this, Buddhism or using this ancient wisdom, which is really, far more encompassing than just success, but sort of the way it's been packaged or commercialized in the West is, meditate for 20 minutes, not for enlightenment, but for focus. But
Mm.
how did you begin to navigate that, and how has that evolved?
Yeah, I think it's evolved significantly, certainly over the time that I've been involved in this. And I think it started out as, yes, mindfulness and meditation to give you some reprieve so that you could come back to work less stressed. I think that was kind of where it started when I was sort of a decade ago embarking on this journey. And I think now it's gotten to a point, particularly with the sporting world using this technology as well. It's gotten to the point now where we're talking about this from a performance perspective rather than a wellness one. So when we talk about peak performance, Buddhist monks and nuns will talk about peak performance of our mind from a cognitive perspective in exactly the same way that we talk about peak performance from a productivity and delivery perspective in our corporate worlds. And so I think for me, it's that middle ground. And I think you're right, it can be mispackaged or misused in the same way that when we had a big run on building resilience in our organizations, it was used in a way to then be able to get more out of people. And I think slowly we're starting to understand that if we are to get the most out of our resources and our people, that the return on investment in that is to actually allow them the space and the time, rather than this being time away from work to decompress. It actually becomes part of the work, because if we're not integrating this stuff in our daily life, then we're not going to be able to come back day after day and perform at our peak. So I think it's less about getting more out of people and more about focusing on the quality of what we get out of people. And I think for me, that's the big difference here between how we've run our organizations and what sustainability looks like. And that's the difference between quality and quantity.
Mm. So when you came back with these new understandings, what was different in your work? Someone hung out with you, or you led a workshop or something. What would they notice?
I think the biggest difference for me has been my mindset and my approach to this. So for me, taking space from work was always a luxury item, and it was something you did as a reward when all the hard work had been
Hmm.
done. It was a bit of a self-indulgence as well, and that's why I burnt out, I think. And this relationship is totally flipped in this space, that this now becomes the non-negotiable stuff that I do so that I can deliver on everything else. And I'll often talk to organizations I'm working with and say, look, this space and self-care and investing in ourselves as humans, it's not on any of your job descriptions, but it probably should be, because it literally powers everything else that is on those job descriptions. And I think that's been the biggest change for me. It's seeing this as part of my work, not space away from work. It's not a break. It's part of the work because it enables me to show up and be my best. And what I've noticed is this whole less is more concept that I think is so important in this space, because we feel like this is going to cost us time. But my experience has been this saves me time. The time I spend doing this stuff, even in my work day, saves me time because of the effectiveness then I have, and the sharpness and the energy and yeah, sometimes even the focus as well. But this is done not to get more out of me, but to get a better quality from me. So it's quality rather than quantity. And I think that's where we've gone wrong in our corporate landscapes a lot of the time. We focus on quantity, hours worked, rather than quality, value, and impact. And I think that's been the biggest turning point for me.
Hmm. So when you say this stuff, what are the practices that you incorporate every day?
So for me, and I think this is personal preference, everybody is different in terms of how they approach this. But for me, my go-tos have always been meditation, yoga, opportunity to move. So whether that's a walk on the beach, a kayak, I love to surf. It's generally something that's by the ocean. I find the ocean has a really calming effect on me, mentally and physically. It's time with people I love, and that includes the dog as well, a bit of pet therapy. And it's time in nature as well, just being out, walking in the forest and having that time to re-energize. And that's my personal preference in terms of the stuff I do. But I'm often saying to people, it's less about what you do, because we're all different, and more about how we prioritize it and our mindset towards whether we feel like this is an indulgence or a necessity.
So for me, there's like a lot of the things that you just mentioned feel like there's a little bit of a hump I have to get over to get into them, right? Like there's a difference between, let's say, meditating and watching some crap on TV, right? Like it's easier to go to the crap on TV, which feels
Yeah.
like self-care, except by the end it isn't. Did you get to a point where the meditation was like, oh boy, I can't wait, the same way,
Mm.
like does that shift as you do it?
Yeah, and I think that's the difference for me, and I think it's something I'm often advising other people. This has to be stuff you enjoy. If it's another thing on your to-do list that you feel pressured to do, then it just becomes hard work, and it doesn't have then the intended effect it should. So for me, the practices I've done long enough to not only form a habit around, but also to notice the benefits. And I know for me, the benefits of meditating far outweigh the benefits of binge watching Netflix. So I'm more inclined to want to do that because I know it feels better and it does me much more good. I think you're right. In the early days, it takes a lot of effort to do this stuff, especially when it's new and we're having to learn it. But I think, like any good habit, you do it often enough. Once you start to see the benefits, that's the motivation to continue to return. So for me, these things are not a chore. They're things that I look forward to because of the way they make me feel.
So what do you tell people who work in sort of corporate environments, big offices, fluorescent lights, windows that don't open? Last night as I was relaxing, my wife and I started watching Severance, and the opening scene, he enters the building and it's like a 1 minute camera shot of just him walking through like white, bright corridors. And it was very evocative of kind of like not in nature, not stuck in this rectanguloid world. How can when you work with organizations, do you work just on the people, like somehow managing to do things, or do you also work on like the culture, the physical culture, the environment in which we're existing?
Yeah, you're so right. I think the environment makes it probably more challenging, and the environment is often something we can't control as well. I think we probably have more control over that these days with flexible working and hybrid working. We spend more time out of the office than we used to, and I'm a big believer of focus on what you can control. And for some people, the only thing they can control is what they do on their lunch break or if they take a lunch break. So it's starting small. It's getting out of that office to get some fresh air and some natural sunlight. It's taking a walk around the block so you're moving if you're sat at a desk all day. It's walking meetings. It's going to a class at lunchtime or starting your day differently. And I think sometimes we can't control what we do at those hours that we're in the office, but we can control what we do either side of that. And, there's all sorts of schools of thought out there around, well, if you get up at this time, you can do X amount of things before you even get into that said environment that will set you up for success. But I'm a big believer in small steps make a big difference. And so I think that makes it more doable as well. So I don't tend to work on the environment. I work with the people so that they can navigate the environments they find themselves in.
Mm-hmm. And when you're doing that work, I mean, from your website, you have such a beautiful and holistic vision. It's not about business; it's about like human life and the planet. And yet, you're working in these very constricted, constrained environments. I'm asking for myself as someone like I see what business could be and the gap between what it is and where, where I want it to go. And I can find myself hamstrung. Like I just kind of want to blow it all up and start over. How do you, I'm assuming that you have, similar impulses, like what human society could be and what we could grow for each other. How do you navigate, like, internally this? Is there frustration, like, the small steps that you mentioned, sort of a consolation prize, or how do you keep your head straight around that? Because I have difficulty.
Yeah, yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. And I'm in the same boat. So one of the reasons I focused on how do I support the individuals is from that frustration. Trying to change the systems and the way we approach work felt a little bit of a fruitless task. So my work became, how do I support the people in the environments they find themselves? And I think we're starting to see a shift in that space on a bigger scale, with trials of the 4-day work week and things like that happening, more flexible hybrid working, walking meetings. There is an opportunity now for people to, I'll often say in my workshops, when was the last time you have had your best idea? And people are generally not at work when that happens. They're outside doing something, or they're in the shower, or their brain is in a different space. And so I think we're cottoning on to that fact that being trapped in a windowless room with aircon switched to 18 and UV lights is perhaps not conducive to our best performance. Having said that, though, our businesses are stuck on an old model that we've used pretty much ever since the Industrial Revolution, right? When we paid people by the hour to work in factories, and we're still paying people a salary to do a job in a small cubicle, which feels quite soulless, and expecting them to, be at peak performance at the same time. And I reckon that for me, work and life is not separate. I don't believe that life starts when work stops. I believe it's all the same. It's all life, and work is part of that life. So I think when we start to see it holistically and we start to take control as a human, what do I do to make this better? And for some people, it is stepping away from the office where they can. So it's actually, I'm only going into the office 1 or 2 days a week because it is that kind of environment. And I do my best work away from the office. Or actually, I've set myself up a beautiful space in the corner of the office full of plants and all the other things that I love. And that helps me through. So it's taking those little things that can make a difference. And often it's getting away from that environment that makes the biggest difference where we can, even if it's just for half an hour as we walk around the block at lunchtime.
Mm. That's it. So you mentioned that things are shifting a little bit. Can you talk about some of the best trends you've seen, like the best news since you've been doing this work?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when I first started doing this work, we were having this conversation very much as this is a wellness conversation. It's nice to have. It's sort of individual accountability. We'll put some free fruit in the staff room and we'll maybe do a few yoga classes around Mental Health Awareness Week. And that was kind of it. Whereas I think now the conversation has moved more towards this being a sustainability conversation, a resource management conversation. We're seeing people the same as we see our most precious resources, I guess. And the return on investment, therefore, needs to be how do we treat these people, not to get more out of them, but to get the best out of them. And we're also seeing this change because the current generation entering the workforce have very different ideas and opinions in terms of how they work, when they work, how they're motivated. And I think that's helping organizations shift their assumptions to attract talent from Gen Z and the generations that will come after, because things are different now. And the 4-day work week, obviously, I've mentioned that was another example of how we might sort of play with some of this stuff and trial some of this stuff. And we do a lot more of our work now out of an office than we ever used to. There are, particularly the tech companies, there are offices look very different now than they used to as well, in terms of the pictures we've got on the wall, the table tennis or football, soccer, the table football, all the little things that we have to make it more playful and hopefully as a result more innovative as well.
I'm cluing on to the term sort of like value, in terms of like the value that people provide. And has that changed at all, in terms of, like, is it all still like totally sort of bottom line based economic? Are there organizations that are looking at other things besides profitability of the bottom line in terms of what constitutes value for the organization?
Yeah, it's really hard to measure, right? I think that's one of the things right from my days in HR. One of the things that's always been challenging is it's really hard to measure in a tangible, numerical way anything to do with people. We can measure lost time from absences, but in terms of productivity, it's so hard for us to put a number around someone performing at their best and what that looks like, or innovation and ideas. So the closest I've come to that is my own lived experience and describing this in a way, the difference between quality and quantity. So when I first started my business, because it was new and because I wanted to succeed, and obviously because of all of my background and being a high achiever and all the stuff that led me to burnout, I went in both feet and I was working all hours. And then I realized, hang on a minute, you started this business because you wanted freedom from the corporate structure and the overwork. And now you're replaying exactly the same patterns, trying to do this by yourself. And you've got all this freedom to be able to decide your own hours. And that was the aha for me between quantity and quality. And so, for example, now, one of the best ideas I've had all month happened when I was out on a kayak on the ocean. So for all intents and purposes, it looked like I was off work, but I was mulling over a problem. I was thinking about the title of my next book. And sometimes the best ideas in terms of that quality, the best ideas that are worth millions of dollars happen when we're not in the office. And that's the difference between quality and quantity. If you can produce one thing a week that is worth $1 million, that's going to probably out-earn all the other 50 things on your to-do list that you were going to sit down and bash out and work 80 hours that week to get done. And I think that when we start to see it that way, it's incredibly difficult to measure, but when we start to see it that way, we start to then detach from, I've just got to work harder and do more, because that's not always us at our best.
I've coached a lot of people around this idea of not just trying to get more and more done. And when I coach entrepreneurs or founders, it's pretty easy. But when I coach people in organizations, there's a lot of pushback. And I, as a coach, never having worked in one of those big organizations, I pushed back against the pushback, and I was wrong, because the culture does demand, you be available from 6 to 9 p.m. for handling these daily emergencies, that there are these meetings you have to I was coaching this guy who's almost at the C-level in a very large company. And we could not figure out a way for him to step away that didn't look like it was going to, really undermine his authority, his credibility, and his promotion, possibilities. And if he ever got that promotion, he'd be twice as busy.
Yeah. And it's so common, right? It's so common. And I think the way I'll often talk about this is slowing down to speed up. And it doesn't always have to be in our work day either. Sometimes it's what we do outside of work that prepares us for work days like that. But even work days like that have to be the exception rather than the rule, because from a sustainability perspective, we can't keep up with that all the time. And this concept of slowing down to speed up that I often talk about, I like to describe in terms of waves. And when we're at the peak of our wave, that should be us at our best. But whenever you're near the ocean, waves come in sets, right? It's not just all one big wave. And the waves are different sizes. And often there's that period between sets where the water's just still. And I liken that to our approach to performance, or a more effective approach to performance, because we think if we're on the peak wave for as long as we can be, that's us at our best. But eventually we fall off that peak wave because it's not sustainable. And so when you look at the rolling waves and the peaks and troughs, each trough helps us hit the next peak. And it's in those troughs that we need our rest and recovery time. And the sporting world are really good at this. Athletes are really good at knowing this. They know to hit, whether it's game day or race day, they need to have that trough the other side and before to help prepare, to help rest and recover. And then they're ready to hit the next peak. And that's why we play our sport in seasons, to allow for that to happen. We don't have the same methodology towards our corporate lives. We're just on constantly all the time, and we're expected to be at that peak. But from a sustainability perspective, if we slow down, what ends up happening is we become sharper, more focused, more energized. We get better ideas. We solve problems quicker. So often I'll put this in an example so it makes more sense. Often I'll use the lunch break as an example. When we're really busy, we feel like we don't have time to take a lunch break. But if we take half an hour away from the office, get some fresh air, stretch our legs, eat something, that 5-hour workload that we might have been looking at in the afternoon now only becomes 4, because things don't take as long. We make less mistakes, so we're not going back redoing things. We're fresher, sharper, quicker, more innovative. We solve problems easier. We make decisions more accurately. And we're probably more tolerant with those around us, so we don't cause as much conflict in when we're doing this stuff. So when we look at all that stuff, that half an hour that we thought we couldn't afford for our lunch break, rather than costing us time, has saved us an hour on the workload because of how we're able to perform. And that's that wave approach. When we're utilizing the trough and we're taking that time to slow down, we then become more effective and speed up. And of course, on the craziest days in our office, we might not get that opportunity, but we do get that opportunity either end of the day when we go home. So it's what we do when we go to sleep, what time we go to bed, whether we've watched Netflix or not, what we do in the morning when we wake up. Sometimes the only control we have over that workday is the stuff that happens outside of the office when we're at home. But that again is that trough of the wave that helps us then hit the next peak.
So one thing that's occurring to me as you're talking about, and I love the metaphor of athletics to business because it's so clear in athletics, that's, coaching has happened in sports well before anyone in the business world thought about getting a coach. And I think there's a difference in that if we're bringing the athletic metaphor, that everybody at the office is an athlete. Whereas a lot of people who are sort of even managers and leaders are more like the physical trainers or, the coaches, the therapists. So like there are days at which I'm at my best when because I'm supporting other people emotionally, cognitively, and has nothing to do with what I'm doing on the field. It's what I allow other people to do on the field.
Yeah. That's a really good analogy, particularly for a leader, right? Because your role should be to step back and allow the team to deliver on the day. And it's everything you've done before that gives them the opportunity to perform. And I think for leaders, it's incredibly difficult because we really only have 2 levers to pull as a leader. We either have less coming in, so we say no to work, or we delegate that work because otherwise we become the bottleneck. And I think that's so true of so many leaders that are too busy. They've either taken on too much or they've not had the choice. They've been landed with too much, or they haven't been able to pull that other lever, which is get more resource, delegate some of this, get help, support, because that's the only 2 options. It's either control what's coming in or increase what's going out. Otherwise, you do become the bottleneck. And I think there's far too many leaders who are too busy. And when we're too busy as a leader, there's a massive part of our job we're not doing. And that's the strategic thinking, the planning for the future, the vision, the mulling over problems, the innovation, the stuff that requires space in our schedule and time. And most leaders don't have enough of that. And yet it's such a critical part of the role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have stories about leaders whom you've helped to kind of create that space? Because it sounds so good in theory. And yet when we're in it, it almost feels impossible. To good positive tales for us.
Yeah. I mean, I work mostly with women leaders. So a lot of it's not just the stuff that's happening in work, it's the stuff that's happening outside of work as well. So a lot of the family demands and how you juggle everything. And one of the things that's helped the women I've worked with has been presence, being able to be present wherever you are and knowing that you won't always get it perfect. So when you're at home, being present with family and not worrying about work and not logging on to emails. And then when you're at work, being present at work and being able to do the job knowing that you perhaps won't do all of it before you have to leave, particularly if you've got kids to pick up and you're leaving early, as an example. And one of the clients I was recently coaching, we had a bit of a breakthrough when we were talking through this notion of priorities and different priorities. And I think it comes from Greg McKeown's book, Essentialism. He talks about the origins of the word priority. And apparently in the English language, you can find it dated back to the 1400s, but only as a singular. So it was always priority. And it means the one thing that is more important than anything else. And it's only since the 1900s and around about the Industrial Revolution that it became a plural and we started to talk about priorities. So the fact that we can have 30 priorities now and be spread too thin and wondering why we're not achieving is because we don't focus on the one thing that's most important. And that, granted, not all of us have only got one priority a day. That would be a lovely dream to have, but probably unrealistic. But we always have one priority for now, one priority for the next hour, one priority for after lunch, one priority for after work. And so each time we're focusing all of our energy and attention on one priority. And with this client, we were talking about digging for water. So digging a well. And if you stand in one place and dig for water, it's probably the most productive thing to do. But if you're dotting around, digging lots of holes, looking for water, you're never going to get deep enough to find the water. And I think that's true with our energy and attention on our priority. What's the priority for now? And for this particular client, she was saying that she can approach her work and her family life through that lens of what is my one priority right now? And sometimes that changes because sometimes you have a priority at work and then a crisis happens and that becomes the priority. But knowing that we can never do it all and knowing that we're just focusing on the thing in front of us and then there'll be another thing and another thing, that can reduce some of the overwhelm. And that was certainly useful for her in terms of managing the many demands of not just a busy C-suite job, but family as well.
So I have a client who has been struggling with the idea of prioritizing in that when they make their plan, they then discover that the plan gets thrown out the window because exigencies, emergencies, the unexpected, and they feel a little bit like, was the planning time wasted? And, I don't think it is, but I'm a coach, so I don't hammer home my opinions. I help them kind of explore the value of the planning, even when the planning gets thrown out. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think we always have to have a plan, but I think we also can't be too attached to the plan because, as you say, quite often the plan changes and often our plans are out of our control. We like to think they're in our control. That's why we do planning, right? To give some level of certainty. And yet I feel like we need to be detached from that so that if the worst happens and the plans fall away, we can still carry on. And I feel like planning is never wasted because whatever was realized through that process of planning is going to help you for the future, even when the plan falls apart. So I think the plan it might be off the table right now if there's a crisis that's happened and come over the top of it. And that happens to most of our plans, to be fair. But the plan's still there. So there'll be parts of that plan you can revisit and parts of that plan. There's that whole adage that there's always enough time if it's important. Mm-hmm. And whilst crises tend to be the most important things that overlay our plans, if there are important things on that plan, you come back to it. Or it features in the next plan. So I feel like a plan is never wasted. It's something you build on. And so we can plan, but we also need to plan for the plan not going to plan, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think this is something I've been having difficulty articulating with my client, but there's a meta value in planning that, like, you have to be thinking certain things in certain ways in order to engage in the planning process, right? And those principles are still going to be valuable, right?
100%. Yeah, 100%. And I think going through that process of planning does something to your brain that means the next time you sit to plan, things are different in a positive way. And I think, when I think about my own planning, there are things that have been on my plan for 5 years that I don't get to because of other things that happen. But the fact they're on my plan means that they keep coming back around. So it never goes away because it's almost like a memo and a constant reminder that, remember, this was something you were keen on making happen. And now might not be the right time, or I might have run out of time, but it's still on the plan. So it still keeps popping up and featuring. And I think you're right, that mental process that we go through when we plan, it sets wheels in motion that may not be realized right now. And we might not feel that the plan's gone to plan, but in the future, that process will serve as dividends in terms of how it impacts what we then plan to do or do without planning because of the planning we did previously.
Gotcha. Great. That's helpful. So I'm trying to seeing in my mind sort of the peak C-suite women that you work with, and then the peak monks and nuns from these, and I guess I'm imagining like supernatural powers, right? Whether it's bilocation or levitation or simply like this presence that you feel like this person has just, they're just so good at this thing, like the Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan, right? Of presence. And I'm wondering what have you seen or helped or worked with leaders who developed it to at least such an extent that it became like noticeable and had a tangible impact on their organizations?
100%. Where I've seen it work well with leaders is the self-awareness, the being able to sit in a room and absorb everything that's going on around you, to be able to listen intently and understand and be open and curious. It's something that I'll often talk about as self-mastery, and we see that in whether it's Zen master monks or martial artists. It's this discipline, this grounded confidence, this inner knowing, this self-awareness, this ability to have empathy towards others, a kindness and compassion because you are so sure about who you are. This innate sharpness and focus and almost an energy that they emit. So I love that you talked about presence because that's exactly what that is. Then when you translate that into the boardroom, we talk about influence and impact. That all comes from presence. And a lot of the time, particularly in times of change and crisis, a lot of the time, you just walking into a room as a leader has a massive impact positively or negatively on those around you just from that presence and your state and how you show up. And I think that's something that we've underrated in our leadership training to date. We've been very much focused on our technical skills and the ability of being a leader as opposed to how you show up. And I believe, we're seeing a shift in that space over the last decade, but leadership is so much more about who you are than what you do these days. And yet so many leaders are still stuck in the what am I doing space and continually doing rather than working on who they are being and that ripple effect then that they have on people around them. So that discipline around their own needs, that self-awareness, that inner state, energy, the awareness not just of themselves but others and the energy in the room. And I think in times of crisis and change, when people are looking to us to lead, that's what they're looking for. And so often that can be something we haven't prioritized in terms of our own development and nobody's told us is important. But that's certainly been the transferable skills I've seen and the stuff that's worked well, particularly from a presence perspective and an impact and influence perspective, how we translate from the mountaintop, if you like, into the boardroom.
Which leads me to, you mentioned AI in your website, and I don't know if it's something you sort of threw in passing or whether you think a lot about it. I had a conversation a couple of days ago with a guy who has always got his finger on trends and is very interested in like where things are going. And his view is that AI is really changing everything rapidly, and it's going to significantly shift the human experience, and especially around work and whose work is going to be needed and whose isn't. What are your thoughts about the intersection of you helping to create better humans and this tidal wave of innovation and change that's could lift us all or could drown us?
Yeah, you're so right, Howie. And I think for many of us, we're scared about that, right? We're scared about the uncertain future and what does that mean? And will I still have a job? And can I keep up with the pace of change? Because we know that AI has already changed things dramatically and will continue to do so at quite a rapid rate. My perspective on this is that our humanness becomes our point of difference. So AI is going to bring huge change and positive ones as well. I'm quite excited about what the future looks like. I'm sure there'll be some unintended consequences like there are with any kind of large scale change. But what remains throughout that is that our humanness as leaders and how we lead and how we show up and how we treat others, how we make people feel, that becomes our point of difference. Because when you look at what we've staked our career claim on, for most leaders, it's been the decades we've spent studying, all of the technical skills and abilities that we have. That often is what gets us the leadership role in the first place. And of course, that's the stuff that AI will be able to replicate and replace. So the only point of difference we have then is our human ability, is our emotional intelligence, is our humanness. And when we lead from a human-centered perspective, and when we're more concerned about how we make people feel and the state and how we show up and how we guide others through this change and uncertainty, for now at least, that's the stuff that AI is not doing. And so for leaders, I think that's our point of difference. And if we can upskill in that space, I think we future-proof ourselves for a world that will be vastly different with AI on board.
And another intersection that I'm curious about is sort of, the work you do, AI, and specifically women in leadership positions. You write that women feel like they often don't fit in male-dominated environments. AI could go either way. I suspect, most AI appears to be, I'll be a little crude. It's sort of like, the Silicon Valley tech bros built their own intellectual sex doll. Like
Yes.
like I don't see it as necessarily favoring equality and equity and diversity. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because AI will be a product of the people that train it, right? And so it's gathering information from all different sources to learn. And I heard someone talk about it the other day as think of it as a toddler that's being parented by multiple different parents, not all of whom are perhaps great parents. And there's an opportunity, I think, for women. So the statistics show that women are not taking up AI at the same rate as their male counterparts. We're sort of standing back and waiting to see what's happening. And that might be for that reason, right? If this is a product of a very male-dominated environment and the tech industry being how it is, then potentially that's not going to encourage women to get involved. However, if women are not at the table and are not having a voice in these discussions, if we are not using AI and responsible, therefore, for training it, then of course that's going to be a huge part of the population that AI doesn't represent. So it's almost a double-edged sword. Women don't feel like they can get involved, and not all women, many are. But if we don't, we run the risk of AI being more biased and not fit for purpose for where women are concerned. So I feel like there's an opportunity here for us to embrace this and to be part of the journey. It'll be a really interesting discussion in the future to see how all this turns out, because we know that humans are biased. And if humans are building AI, that would suggest that AI is too. However, AI appears to be slightly more clever than humans, so potentially it might train itself out of that. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing if it developed the capability to be fairer and more just and less discriminatory than its human modelers?
Yeah, well, if it had an algorithm that said, like, how can this organization be its best? I was talking with our friend Keith Edwards, who does diversity, equity, inclusion work, and the one of the things he said was, like, over the past month and a half since the Trump administration took over and forbade language like inclusion and gender and equity. So the same work he's doing, he has to call it by different names. Instead of calling it equity leadership, he's calling it leadership. Instead of calling it diversity, he's calling it performance. I said, like, I actually like those better because they're what they are. And so, like,
Exactly.
if AI were to say, like, what could we do to have this organization really be great in the world? Hopefully it would do those things to include and empower women and other groups that have traditionally not been at the top of the food chain.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I think you're so right. And Keith as well. It's I think it was the Shakespeare line, wasn't it? A rose by any other name still smells as sweet. And I think this is true in this case. I think when you ask what makes a great leader, so you ask your AI tool, what makes a great leader, it will spit out some of the very things that we're not allowed to say anymore. It'll spit out, different words that mean the same thing. It'll be how we treat others and how we are curious and open, how we leave ego at the door, how we involve everybody in the conversation, how we can get a diverse set of experience in our team so that we get a better idea. And I think when we have this conversation around our tables these days and we talk about things like, hey, I just want a culture where everyone can be included, or I just want an environment in my workplace where everyone belongs, regardless of what they look like and sound like. There's not many people in the world that say no to that that's not a good idea. And I think sometimes when we take some of those, shall we say, heated conversations out of the mix, we're all still talking about exactly the same thing. And I think maybe that's where AI will perhaps help, because it will cut through all the language and go, well, this is what you mean. This is what you need. Regardless of what we call it, a fair and equitable world for everyone can't be a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things I've struggled with, and I have, is like two flavors of feminism as they apply to the workplace. And one of them was, like, I would say, like early stage, like feminism saying, like, we need more femininity, we need more feminine energy in the world to balance, right? And then there was like the second wave of professional women, which was feminism, like be like a man, right? And there's some echoes of this in your learning outcomes for women around, like, build confidence to apply for promotions. And I've got to say, like, I would like to build unconfidence in men to ask for, instead of saying, like, women should be just like men, like to apply for things completely unqualified for, which I see in men all the time, applying and getting, to not having self-doubt, to drowning the inner critic somehow. How do you navigate those tensions?
Yeah. Again, it's coming back to focus on what you can control. And most of the time, unfortunately, we can't control overconfident men who apply for promotions and sometimes get promotions that they're perhaps not cut out for. The one thing we can control as women is we know that there's a tendency for women to underestimate their skills and ability, or to look for more security. So because of the societies we've grown up in and the inequities that exist, women will often think they need more experience, more skills, more assurity that they can do the job before they apply for it. And I think that's the big difference here. So it's not becoming overconfident. It's getting rid of the self-doubt and all of the cultural norms and baggage that we often carry into that moment to be able to do what everybody else seems to be doing around us. And I think, particularly for women, one of the things I'm often saying is, this is not about having to change something about yourself. And quite often for women, it has been about that. So women will feel like they have to be less empathetic to be taken seriously, or to behave more like a man so that they're seen as an assertive leader. And that's often where we go wrong. And some of the very things that make us different to a lot of the role models that are around us, which for many years, particularly people as old as me, have been male leaders. That's been our, I didn't know any female leaders until I was perhaps in my fourth or fifth role. And so we look at that masculinity in approach. And of course, from an energy perspective, regardless of gender, we've all got masculine and feminine energies. But when more of one is on show, it tends to be the thing we think, well, I need to have more of that to be a serious leader. And that takes us away from the very point of difference we have as a woman stepping into that role. So I'm very big on, rather than trying to change something about ourselves to fit in, how do we leverage our difference to stand out or to be the difference around that table?
Yeah, when women show more empathy and inclusion, does that sometimes backfire in that, that men will apply a stereotypical lens to it?
Oh, look, I think women are often, particularly women in the media, in the spotlight, or in senior leadership roles, are often damned if they do, damned if they don't. So if you act more assertive so that people take you seriously, you get called a bully or aggressive often as a woman. If you embrace what makes you feminine, then you get called too weak or soft. And so there's this very fine line, because at the same time, everybody's telling you, just be your authentic self. And so this very fine line that women often find they tread. And, we know this from the comments that the media have, whether it's a sporting professional or a leader, particularly in the political space. It's very different. Women are judged very differently to their male counterparts. They're judged about whether they have children or not, and the impact that's going to have on their role, what they wear, what they look like, whether they're aging. And that's very different. And so there's a lot of, again, I'm always saying to the women I work with, focus on what you can control. And a lot of the time that is not other people's perceptions. It does, however, make it incredibly more difficult. These are the headwinds that we talk about that female leaders often face into. And unless you've been a female leader, it's often difficult to appreciate what those headwinds look and sound and feel like. And then when you're asked the question, well, what should I do for the best? I'm always saying, do the only thing you can do. Show up as yourself, leverage your strengths, and do your job. You may still end up being judged unfairly because of the society that we live in. But again, we can't always control that part of things. We can only control ourselves and how we show up.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Now you have a link on your website that goes to actually a different website, Men as Allies, right? So can you talk a little bit about that work?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting journey for me. So I've spent a decade working in the women in leadership space, and it was about 18 months ago I started to partner with a male colleague to run Male Allies sessions. And this came from a place of, if I really want to change the world, yes, I'm supporting women to navigate the world, but I've also got to support the systems that those women exist in. And it's a system I've experienced myself as a woman. And the majority of our leaders are still male. So it makes sense that if we are to make any systematic change in this space, men have to be involved in the conversation. And yet, quite often when we think about women's rights or underrepresented groups getting more representation, it tends to fall on the shoulders of the very groups it's designed to support these initiatives for them to run. And so my work in this space with my collaboration colleague has become around how we engage men in this conversation. And I reckon that's super important, because my experience has been most men want to be part of this conversation. They also want a better world. Many of them have got daughters, wives, people that they care about, that they want to see a different world for. And yet they're a little bit unsure about how to navigate this space. Should I be in this space? Am I taking up space? How do I help and support without being offensive? What if I'm taking up too much space or mansplaining? So having a space where they can have that conversation and start to understand and learn about the experiences of women and their role in that, and not just from a gender perspective, but just an equity one, right? How do we start to understand experiences different to our own? And how do we open the door so that everybody gets a seat at the table in a way that means no one is losing out? Because I think that's the other thing in this conversation. There's a lot of fear and scarcity, and we're seeing that play out on a global scale with a lot of our male leaders. If I open the door to others, I'm going to lose out. So how do we make this a better place for everyone where no one loses out? And that's how the Men as Allies program was born. And it's been super popular, certainly over this side of the world where I am in Australasia. And I think the conversation is starting to happen more often in organizations now around, hey, this is everyone's job. And if we engage the majority in the conversation, we make more progress.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Before we go, how can people find you, follow your work, learn more about you? Do you travel outside Australasia, or
Yes, I love to travel. So my family is scattered across the globe. So I'm often trotting between Europe, and I actually live in New Zealand. So New Zealand and Europe. And the website is the best place to find me, jessstuart.co.nz. LinkedIn is also a good space as well to connect. Jess Stuart on LinkedIn.
Okay, since there are ambiguous spellings of Stuart, could you spell out the URL?
Yes, it is Stuart. So JESSSTUART. redefine.co.nz.
And for my American listeners, that's NZ.
It is, you're right.
Great. And do you have newsletter or anything where people can consume
I
your
do,
brain?
yes. So there's a YouTube channel. All of this is accessible from the website. There's a resources page on the website. There is also a Instagram, and you'll be able to contact me through the website as well. So there's a contact page for anyone that is wanting to continue the conversation.
Fantastic. I don't know why I'm going to ask you this, but you have any exciting books or music that you're into right now that you care to share?
I'm actually taking a break from consuming at the moment. So I've done a lot of that over the summer break, because obviously we've just had summer here in the Southern Hemisphere. And I'm actually wanting to create more space in my brain for other things that might arise from within me in terms of ideas and creativity. So I love reading and podcasts. I play music as well. And I love to write. And I'm trialing something different this year by actually cutting that off for a while and seeing what else emerges when I just leave my brain to its own devices. So we'll see how that goes. It may be a failed experiment that you revert, but it's something new and different.
That's a very Buddhist answer to consumption. Cool. Well, Jess Stuart, thank you so much for all of the work you're doing in the world and for taking the time to have this conversation today. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
Take care.